The Indian Army and the Pakistani Army were born out of the British Indian Army. While the Indian Army carried on with its plural traditions and secular ethos, the Pakistani Army started to base itself on the initial formulation of Pakistan's ideology, which emphasized on the inherent relationship between Islam and nation. While General Zia-ul-Haq is generally credited with Islamization of the Pakistan Army, others before him, like General Ayub Khan and General Yahya Khan, did not fail to make use of symbolism of Islamic traditions and Islamic symbolism to serve their personal political gains. General Ziaul Haq just legitimized that process. Today, the Pakistan army is faced with an ideologically similar but diametrically opposite the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan and Tehreek-e-Labbaik Pakistan, and it is finding it very difficult to motivate its army to roll back the genie of radicalization back into the bottle. To discuss the character of the Pakistan army, we have with us Shri Rana Banerji, former Special Secretary, Cabinet Secretariat, who headed the Pakistan desk. Welcome to Samvad, sir.
Thank you very much, Mayank, once again.
So to start off with, it is generally believed that General Zia-ul-Haq started the process of Islamization of Pakistani army using the anti-Soviet jihad as a starting point. But do you agree with this assessment, or perhaps the assessment that the Pakistan army was born as an ideological army with Islam as its corporate ideology?
I would agree with the latter definition, which has been given by Dr. Christine Fair in her book Fighting to the End, the Pakistan Army, which gives a very clear picturization of what has motivated the Pakistani establishment ever since partition. It would be an understatement to say that the Pakistan Army was Islamized only under Zia. It was born as an ideological army, and it was inextricably interlinked with the two-nation theory, which saw Pakistan as a separate country for Muslims. There was a quest for its identity, to establish its identity because of certain insecurities accompanying the partition. Uh, and both its political and military leaders wanted to strengthen this identity with the buttressing force of Islam. So you had the objectives resolution passed in 12th March 1949, which spoke of the ideology and rather ironically the democratic faith of Islam, where it said that the sovereignty of Allah alone would matter. But thereafter, of course, democracy was thrown to the winds due to the delays in the constitution making process and the takeover by first Mr. Ghulam Ahmad, then Sikandar Mirza, and finally by Ayub, using the Article 90 of the then constitution. Now, Ayub Khan initially wanted a modern Islam. He was not personally a very devout follower of Islam, but he still wanted to pick and choose with the Sunni aspects or the Sufi aspects of Islam and use them to reduce the influence of the more radical clerics. And he used Sufi Islam quite cleverly in this regard. Yahya's tenure was too short and too much clouded by his own foibles and controversies. So Islam really did not acquire a sort of grudge to that extent. But after, even Mr. Zulfikar Ali Bhutto never hesitated to use Islam. But after Bhutto's ouster, Zia, when he came to power, or even before coming to power, when he became army chief, he straightaway worked to enlarge the role of the Sunni Islam. He had a belief about Sunni Islam, and there was a sectarian aspect to it. Also, he wanted to, be difficult or harsh on the Shias. So he introduced several provisions, which, as one very well-regarded observer of the Pakistani military's seen, Dr. Hassan Askari Rizvi, has said or described as the regulative, punitive, or extractive aspects which were introduced by him. And he tried to give more emphasis to ritual and teachings in the day-to-day activities of the army in the cantonments. That is when we found the use of, teachings of the gentleman whom what was his name, Dr. Brigadier Abdul Qayyum. He sort of had written a doctrinaire thing about the use of Islam in ideology of Islam in fighting techniques of the army. And then he got the Tablighi Jamaat preachers to regularly give the khutbah on the Friday sermons in the mosques in the cantonments. Plus, he introduced several other restrictive things like, not allowing the use of liquor in the army messes, or curtailed the use of drinking in public, and all these things were introduced. Then the change of the motto all actually occurred even before martial law was introduced by Zia. It occurred in 1976, soon after he took over as the chief of army, and it continued. The practice of having these Tablighi Jamaat preachers delivering the khutbah after the Friday prayers, not only in PMA Kakul but in all other cantonments. It is a practice which continued till 1984. It was stopped by General Asif Nawaz in 1985. And that is very interesting, because even before he took over as army chief, he stopped it when he was corps commander in Karachi. There was a phase in the ISI where, of course, this came a little later, much after Zia, where the Islamic bent or the proclivities of the person in command in the ISI, I refer to Lieutenant General Javed Nasir, the period between March 92 to May 93, when he was the chief of DG in the ISI, where a non-military atmosphere was introduced in the ISI, though otherwise the ISI was a very disciplined outfit of the army. But during his tenure, it became very unruly, and there used to be, officers even and agents, and definitely the non-official staff. They would roam about in Taliban-style pajamas, and there were lots of actions which were authorized, including assistance to the Muslims in Bosnia and all these things, which Javed Nasir did on his personal basis, till the Americans objected and to the army chief and to the prime minister, and he was then removed. And this was done by Wahid Kakar when he was the chief. So Islam has always been used by the army, but Zia tried to ritualize it in practices which were, after Zia, the succeeding chiefs found that this was going to be detrimental to the professionalism in the army. So they introduced a practice of weeding out the more deleterious Islamic practices, and also started a process of screening of officers who were considered to be too Islamic. The long beardos and all, they were weeded out in the promotion process. And this was a process which was carried on by successive chiefs, Asif Nawaz, Jahangir Karamat, even Musharraf. And since then, it has been accepted that the fear of Islamization within the officer class didn't really take root. It's an exaggerated fear. This is a finding which has been recently recorded in this very interesting book called The Quetta Experience. It has been written by an American colonel who attended the Command and Staff College, Quetta, in 1982. And he has studied the attitudes of Pakistani officers at the middle level, at the level of majors to, say, brigadiers or major generals, for the period between 2005 to 2014. And he has come out with this book called The Quetta Experience. So one of the findings there is that the fear of Islamization within the officer class is exaggerated, and the army has put in place filters at various levels to ease out officers with extreme views. So this has happened.
to study the whole history of Islamization, sir, you spoke of the change of motto by General Zia. I mean, he changed the motto from Ittihad, Yaqeen, and Tanzim, unity, faith, and discipline, which was more professional and more military, to Iman, Taqwa, or Jihad fi Sabil Illah, which means faith, piety, and holy war in the path of Allah, which is obviously more Islamic. So, do you perceive that this started to change the character of the Pakistan army, for which the later chiefs had to put in, regulations so that these people could be weeded out?
No, my impression is again that it was more symbolic than anything else, and of course, it might have had an impact. But like when you first go to Pakistan, and like when I first went to Pakistan to serve there in the Indian High Commission, uh, you have an impact in the sense you see this inscribed on the in the walls of the hills, which have been denuded. There, the motto has been inscribed. So you wonder what this is all about in a country that is, otherwise quite similar in social practices and customs, cultural tenets, like any other part of northern India. But then you have this overwhelming presence of the army. It has more to do with the manner in which the army has, strengthened its own position as the defender of the country's sovereignty and very existence. So I think it stems from that, and it didn't really have an impact on the officer class.
So, Brigadier General S.K. Malik wrote the Quranic concept of war in 1979, where he wrote extensively on the Quranic concepts of warfare. And then I'm quoting just a few instances of a whole lot we have academically. And Colonel Saifi Ahmad Naqvi wrote in the Pakistani Army Green Book in 1994, and I'm quoting him that, quote, Pakistan as an ideological state is based on the ideology of Islam. If the ideology is not preserved, then the very existence of Pakistan becomes doubtful, unquote. Furthermore, Stephen Cohen writes that he wrote that expression, quoting Stephen Cohen, expressions such as Pakistan ideology and Islamic glory, which are usually not part of the professional vocabulary of a military person, it has become common phrase. The heads of military departments talk more like etymologists than a soldier, unquote. So, don't you think that this is going to drive the army and the officers more ideologically than out of security concerns?
No, you see, as I mentioned, these doctrines and these books were used only for a limited while in the cantonments. Given this Brigadier Muhammad Abdul Qayyum's concept of war as a teaching or a part of the training course, it was used for a very brief period, say, once Zia had consolidated himself for about 4 or 5 years. But then, thereafter, the other senior generals began to see the problematic aspects of this type of teachings being given as a regular course for professionally emerging officer class. So they gradually diluted the content thereof. And after the plane crash and the as Zia melted away, in fact, Zia himself remained insecure about the extent to which his own these ritualistic aspects of Islam could become, doctrinaire or doctrinal part of the army's doctrinal theology or, behavior patterns. So he tried other things, social, phenomenon to improve or make his own position secure, like, marriages of his own sons or the sons of the DGISI, who was his alter ego, General Akhtar Abdul Rahman. Their sons got married to daughters of other generals, and so these type of alliances between sons and daughters of generals, or between, highly placed bureaucrats, their progeny and army progeny, began to take place in a regular manner. And so this alliance between the military establishment elite and the civil bureaucratic elite also cemented during this the entire 30 or 40 years uh, of Pakistan's existence.
I'll come back to contemporary times, and perhaps try to drive some sense out of what has been happening for a very long time, inspired by the army itself or the deep state, you might say, that they have been using the sponsoring and using the Islamist ideology and political parties for their own personal political gains and to maintain that influence. Now we see Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, which is virtually in a state of revolt. Tehreek-e-Labbaik Pakistan, which at the drop of a hat can block all highways, block Islamabad. So, do you see that this project has gone rogue now?
No, again, you see, it's slightly different. The use of non-state actors by Pakistan, particularly in the Indian context, this has been, part of their geostrategic option as using the asymmetric force of, non-state actors uh, to fulfill objectives of foreign policy, creating disturbance through militancy in Kashmir and elsewhere, uh, without incurring too much military cost in military terms. So they have used this very always again from the time of the sending in the tribals into Kashmir, then periodically 65, then much more sophisticatedly first in Khalistani, spreading Khalistani disturbance in Punjab, and then after Afghanistan, using the trained sort of Islamic elements of the Lashkar-e-Toiba and Jaish-e-Mohammed, these two particularly, sending them into Kashmir. So this has been perfected into a sort of fine art, and under the nuclear umbrella. So this has, after Pakistan became nuclear, so they've sort of done this with great impunity, and this is something uh, which is likely to stay. We have to learn to live with it, and we have, of course, devised our own methods, both domestically to strengthen our anti-terrorism, counter-terrorism grip, and also more recently by conveying, messages of punitive action of a limited nature across the border in case of such action in the form of reprisals. But these have, potential of nuclear escalation, which have to be very carefully calibrated. So that is a different thing. But I would not speak of the TTP and the TLP in the same breath. See, Tehreek-e-Labbaik Pakistan was a more domestic phenomenon. It was an internal domestic card used by the army. First, of course, it was a little bit spontaneous. It had grown through the chaperoning of Khadim Rizvi. They had organized these protests again, protesting against the use of cartoons in France, and then demanding the expulsion of the French ambassador in Pakistan. And then there was, before that, even they had used it for asking for changes in the law that was there passed by the Nawaz Sharif government. And at that time, you see, the army was supporting this group to destabilize the Nawaz Sharif regime. And there was evidence of Faiz Hamid as the DGISI or his juniors actually instigating these people. But in later years, they have tried to control it and have succeeded also in controlling. Khadim Rizvi died, but his son, Saad Rizvi, before that, they tried in the 2018 elections to mainstream the PLP by encouraging them to participate in the elections. And they did participate in the elections, becoming the fifth largest party in terms of votes polled in Punjab and elsewhere. They got 3 seats in the Sindh Provincial Assembly, though they did not win any seats in the National Assembly or in the Punjab Provincial Assembly. But they seem to have, gathered some satisfaction by uh, trying to become a political party. Even in that activity now, their influence seems to have abated, as have other Islamic parties. They have never fared successfully in Pakistani election. The Jamaat-e-Islami or others, the Jamiyat-e-Ulama Pakistan or the Noorani group or Fazlur Rahman group, they have had limited electoral impact. So Tehreek-e-Labbaik Pakistan has been no different. Khadim Rizvi's son, Saad Rizvi, he underwent a long period of detention. Although the courts ruled in his favor for his release, still he was put under different provisions of the Anti-Terrorism Act. And almost the 8 to 9 months of 2021, he remained in detention. He was released only in November 2021. So he remains at the moment quiescent, and he can act as a destabilizing force domestically, but the signal has to be there from the military establishment, and he can be asked to dance to the tune of the military leadership to destabilize domestic civilian politicians as and when they require. The TTP is a somewhat different phenomenon. It is a conglomeration of several, militant groups which have, demanded the implementation of Islamic Sharia, and they remain wedded to the ideology of working to capture, the state and organs of the state by attacking the army establishment. So this is fundamentally different, and they have been influenced by a mix of, very doctrinaire ideology of Wahhabism and also Pashtunwali, the tenets of Pashtunwali, because the majority of them are Pashtuns, and they have allocated local areas of influence to different, tribal chieftains. Like there is the Mohman Taliban or the Bajor Taliban, there is the Jamiat Ulema Herat or the Jamiat Hizbul Herat. Several factions are there and different leaders are there. Hafiz Gul Bahadur is having an influence in North Waziristan. Omar Khalid Khurasani, he became, the JUA leader. And then there were Fakir Muhammad and Mullah Fazlullah, who all operated initially in different areas of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa or NWFP, as it was known earlier. But then they moved into parts of Afghanistan, Kunar and Nangarhar, and they have been making forays from there. Now, what happened more recently was an effort at negotiation between the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan and the Pakistani establishment. This was after the Afghan Taliban came to power in Kabul, and so they were asked to mediate, and they said, "Okay, we will ensure the early initial contacts, and then you all negotiate." And General Faiz Hamid, who was earlier in DGISI and then later as the Corps Commander Peshawar, he took it upon himself to make various promises during the negotiations with the TTP. And it seems that firstly there were a release of a lot of their main prominent leaders, and this was sort of seen as a sort of part of weakness on the part of the Pakistani establishment, and this helped the TTP to become more bold. Also, the leadership of Noor Wali Masood, who was able to effectively unite different groups and become a potent force. And then there was some sort of an agreement which is not acknowledged by the Pakistani establishment, allowing the TTP to come back in some form in the hill areas of Swat. And Swat in 2009 had become a hotbed of militancy. It had been cleansed by the army action. But somehow Faiz Hamid gave a carte blanche to some Taliban leaders to come back here. And then this was opposed by the local people of Swat. Similar, local protests came to notice in Waziristan also. But it seems that during the negotiations, General Faiz Hamid seems to have told Noor Wali Masood that since I am likely to become the army chief, I will ensure that somehow you get back some of your main demands, like the reversal of the merger of FATA. And also, we will try to make accommodation for Islamic Sharia in various ways. And so you abjure violence and come back and adopt peaceful methods of survival. So to this extent, it was there. But then the ceasefire, the talks failed, the ceasefire was withdrawn, the TTP started attacking the Pakistani military and the frontier constabulary, frontier corps people in the border outposts. So now with the new leadership, even in the old leadership, Bajwa then got rid of Faiz Hamid as Corps Commander of Peshawar, and he shifted him to Bahawalpur, brought in a different Corps Commander who was military secretary to him. And this was a message that they would be now having a more tough line. So at present, you see, the army is faced with the serious problem of curbing the militancy of the TTP, and this has assumed quite difficult proportions. And one of their main concerns is to, fix the TTP or curb or break their capacity to hit, at Pakistani military establishment or police establishment in such force. In fact, coming back to this, book, the Quetta experiences, one of the findings of Colonel Smith was also that the younger officers at the level of major and colonels, they revised their security perceptions from, considering India as the enemy number one. They now regard the last 2 decades, where the internal security threat is seen as a more major or existential threat to the existence of the Pakistan army, and India is only regarded as a secondary threat. Now, this may not be true forever. Ultimately, the doctrinaire aspects of the heritage of Pakistan army, the leadership will once again emphasize at any moment of their choosing that India remains the main enemy. But the threat of terrorism hitting inwards has also been acknowledged now, because a lot of young officers and other ranks have been sacrificed as martyrs to the militants. So the TTP is a major threat. It is being faced as one and tackled as one. So I would not speak of it as a sort of element gone rogue, but it's a direct confrontation or an enemy that has to be now fixed or controlled. So that is how I would see it on the Western border.
Sir, how close is this alignment between the TTP and the Taliban? Because the Pakistani army, the Pakistan Defense Minister spoke of bombing areas where they had taken refuge, which is ironical, in Afghanistan. And then the Afghanistan Deputy Prime Minister hit back with that 1971 surrender photo, saying that this can be repeated. So how close is this affiliation between TTP and Taliban, apart from the ideological frontier?
You see, the Afghan Taliban have been indicating to the Pakistan army that, you see, handling the Tehreek-e-Taliban is your baby. You deal with it. It's your problem. We will not get ourselves involved, because there is this, ideological emphasis in Pashtunwali that, if somebody takes refuge in your territory, then he cannot be sacrificed to the enemy. So beyond that, you see, the Afghan Taliban again are beholden to the Pakistan army for all the help that they have given in the last 20 years, enabling them to withstand the American and the international security assistance forces and come to power in Afghanistan. Now, this is a relationship which neither the Afghan Taliban nor the Pakistan army would like to sacrifice just over differences in how to deal with the TTP. They will paper over these cracks, and the relationship effort would be made to keep the relationship good and close. So Sirajuddin Haqqani or the Haqqani faction will remain close to the Pakistani ISI. It will try to be persuaded. They will persuade the Haqqani faction to do their bidding in terms of state objectives. Though the Afghan Taliban do not like the Durand Line issue to be, presented to them as a fait accompli of a permanent border. No Afghan government will be in a position to accept Durand Line as a sort of permanent border between Pakistan and Afghanistan. They would like to keep the issue open. And Pakistan army, the Pakistani establishment, both political and military, would have to learn to live with this vagueness about, the Durand Line, much as they have tried to do a fencing and they have tried to regulate the border incidents through a fencing and increased border presence. But this will remain an Achilles heel, so to speak. But overall, Pakistan army would still not like its relationship with the Afghan Taliban to go back. In between, of course, inside Afghanistan, there are problems. There are problems of ideology between the Taliban leadership themselves, which are going to play out. For example, the latest reports indicate that the Sirajuddin Haqqani and Mullah Yaqub, they are, most unlikely to unite, but they have united against the more, radical leadership of Mullah Haibatullah and the other senior Taliban leaders who have taken such an unyielding stance on the issue of women's education, because this is hampering the overall impact of the Taliban to gain international recognition and to get international assistance, which they direly need. So this is an evolving situation, which we will have to see how it ends.
Sir, Parvez Hurvoy recently wrote an article where the gist of the article is to why the Pakistan army, I mean, he was talking of the lower cadres and the sort of middle cadres, why should they fight TTP? Because they derive inspiration from the same ideology. They come from the same society. They're the same people, basically. So he was asking, he basically asked as to the Pakistani generals should give their boys some genuine reason to fight the TTP. So, if you, hypothetically speaking, what advice, if you were a Pakistani general, what advice would you give your soldiers on fighting
Well,
TTP?
God forbid, but like, God forbid, but even if I put myself in their places, things are slightly more complicated and complex. It is true that the recruitment in the Pakistan army has shifted from the old, heartland Potohar areas of central and upper Punjab to rest of rural Punjab or the urbanized rural Punjab. A lot of small cities like Gujranwala, Multan, Dera Ghazi Khan, Rajanpur, these areas, Bahawalpur, these have come up as army recruiting centers. Punjabi recruits still remain dominant, though an effort has been made from 2010 onwards, particularly to reduce the predominance of Punjabis and to reflect overall population patterns. So Punjabis represent about 55% in the army, and they have tried to bring in more recruits from Sindh and Balochistan and Khyber Pakhtunkhwa also about 20%, and 14% from Sindh and 4% from Balochistan. So these figures, of course, they present as having been achieved, but there may be more Punjabis based in Balochistan who have been recruited, and they are shown in the Balochistan quota. That is possible. So this type of efforts have been made. But what happens when a recruit comes into the Pakistan army? He ascends a vertical ladder of social mobility far more rapidly than the normal other individual occupied in other professions or employed in other professions in Pakistan. So, to put it in other simply, he becomes vertically mobile or richer or more comfortable socially than the rest of the population. Then, when he goes back to the village, he has a certain prestige. Then they have these functions of shuhada, the martyrs functions where, if somebody has lost his life fighting a tribal insurgent of the TTP, then he is, or his relatives are just uh, treated as heroes in the village, and a lot of grants, etc., are made to them, not only of land, but Shuhada memorials are set up, and then their relatives are called and given a lot of social recognition by the army in annual functions that are observed. So these are ways in which the uh, persons who have joined the army or their relatives, they are put on a separate pedestal and given a better status in civil society. So they manage it quite well, and so uh, that is why there are no problems faced in tackling or putting them to use in counterinsurgency action against terrorists of the TTP.
Thank you so much, sir, for sharing your ideas on the character of Pakistan and Pakistan Army, and at what it means for the contemporary times. It's been very informative. Thank you so much, sir. Because on that note, we would be concluding this conversation. Thank you, sir.
Thank you for having me in this interaction.
Thank you, sir.